This is the single most important video you will watch this year. Right now, the United States government owes $37 trillion. That number is so huge, it barely means anything to a normal person. So let me make it simple. That is more debt than any nation in the history of the world has ever racked up. And here is the absolute fatal flaw in the entire system. The government has zero intention of paying it back. They can't. The math simply does not work. Instead, they have a plan to erase it. Not through higher taxes or cutting spending. They are planning to erase $37 trillion in debt by executing the largest, most sophisticated wealth transfer in history, a transfer that will quietly and legally wipe out your dollar savings, your retirement accounts, and your purchasing power before 2027. This isn't theory. This is the financial history playbook being run right now with two critical modern twists: gold and Bitcoin. The crisis is coming. You are about to be robbed legally, quietly, and completely, and most people won't even realize it happened until it is too late. By the end of this video, I'm going to show you exactly how this system works, the government's timeline, and the critical steps you must take to make sure you are not one of the victims. Let's start with the crushing weight of the problem. Imagine you have a credit card and you owe $132,000, but you only make $100,000 a year. That's essentially the position of the U.S. right now. The debt to GDP ratio is 132%. That is higher than any point in American history outside of World War II, but it gets worse. The annual interest payment on that debt is now over $1.2 trillion. Think about that for a second. The government has to spend more money just on interest than it spends on the entire defense budget. It spends more on interest than it spends on Medicare. It is the single largest budget item besides Social Security. And here is the kicker. Interest rates are still high. If rates stay where they are, those interest payments are going to hit $1.8 trillion annually by 2027. We're talking about 6% of the entire economy being spent just on interest, not principal. Just interest. If you cannot afford the interest on your debt, you are insolvent. The U.S. government is effectively insolvent. This is not a political problem anymore. It is a mathematical problem. You cannot tax your way out of 132% debt to GDP. You cannot cut spending enough. When the interest payments alone are consuming 6% of GDP, there is only one solution left that every over-indebted government in history has always turned to: devaluation. They have to redefine what a dollar is worth. They have to make the $37 trillion they owe feel like $15 trillion in real terms. They have to shrink the debt without ever technically defaulting on it. If they just printed money to pay the debt, everyone would see it instantly. The dollar would crash, and confidence would collapse overnight. They need a sophisticated, invisible method. Something that looks like smart policy, something that doesn't look like theft. That's where the historical playbook comes in. We have seen this exact maneuver before. Let's look at a clear, terrifying historical example: the Great Depression. By 1933, the United States was drowning in debt from World War I. The debt to GDP ratio was climbing, and the economy was collapsing. President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew he couldn't pay the debt back traditionally, so he made a radical move. He revalued gold. In 1933, the official price of gold was $20.67 per ounce. It had been that price for 54 years. Your dollar was literally a claim on 1/20th of an ounce of physical gold. The dollar was backed by gold. Then, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 6102. This order made it illegal for American citizens to own gold. You were forced to turn in your gold to the government. They paid you the official price, $20.67 per ounce. Most Americans complied. They traded their gold for dollars. Once the gold was collected, Roosevelt made his move. In 1934, he announced the new official gold price, $35 per ounce. That was a 69% increase in the price of gold overnight. What did this do? The U.S. government now owned most of the nation's gold reserves, which they had just confiscated at the old lower price. Their gold reserves, which were worth about $4 billion at the old price, were suddenly worth $6.8 billion at the new price. They created $2.8 billion in value out of thin air just by changing the accounting price. But the real magic was what happened to the debt. The debt they owed was denominated in dollars. Those dollars were now worth less relative to gold. Before the revaluation, the government debt was 40% of GDP. After the revaluation, and the massive inflation it caused over the next few years, the real debt burden fell to 25% of GDP. They erased 15 percentage points of debt just by revaluing gold and devaluing the dollar. And the American citizens holding dollars? They lost nearly 40% of their purchasing power through the inflation that followed. The people who turned in their gold for $20.67 watched the government revalue it to $35, but they couldn't buy it back. They were stuck holding devalued dollars while the government used their confiscated assets to eliminate its debt. That is the playbook. And it is happening again right now, only this time they are using two assets, gold and Bitcoin. Let's look at the evidence for the new strategy. The U.S. government is running a two-pronged attack to deal with the debt. They need an asset from the past, gold, and an asset from the future, Bitcoin. First, let's look at the gold side. The U.S. officially holds 8,133 tons of gold. At the current market price of roughly $2,800 per ounce, that gold is worth about $731 billion. Not bad, but nowhere near enough to touch a $37 trillion debt. But here's the absolutely insane part. The gold is valued on the government books not at $2,800 an ounce, but at $42.22 per ounce. That price was set by statute in 1973. On the government's balance sheet, the U.S. gold reserve is only worth $11 billion. This is a deliberate accounting trick. They are holding an asset worth over $700 billion and valuing it at $11 billion. Why? Because it gives them massive room to revalue it. When the crisis hits and the debt ceiling fight becomes fatal, the government will announce a new gold revaluation. And they won't just revalue it to the current market price. That would be too boring. They will declare that, for the purposes of the U.S. strategic reserves and debt backing, gold will be valued at $20,000 per ounce. Why $20,000? Because that is the number that makes the math work. At $20,000 per ounce, the U.S. gold reserves are suddenly worth over $5.2 trillion. That is a $5 trillion value creation out of thin air, just by changing the price of an asset they already own. This makes the government's balance sheet look stronger and allows them to say they are moving toward a gold-backed dollar, which is how they will sell it to you. It will be marketed as fiscal responsibility. Now, combine that with the modern twist, Bitcoin. In late 2024 and early 2025, we saw major moves in Washington to formalize a strategic Bitcoin reserve. The stated public goal is to position the U.S. as a leader in digital assets and protect innovation. That's the narrative. The real goal is to create a second new asset they can revalue. The U.S. government currently holds an estimated 210,000 Bitcoin, mostly seized from criminal cases like the Silk Road. That's currently worth billions, but it's still small change for a $37 trillion debt problem. But the key is the new mandate. The government is being directed to acquire more Bitcoin. Proposed legislation targets a goal of 1 million Bitcoin over the next 5 years. They are not buying this on the open market, which would spike the price and cost too much. They are acquiring it quietly, seizing it in ongoing investigations, accepting it as payment for massive regulatory fines from crypto companies, and potentially even mining it using government energy infrastructure. They are accumulating it in the shadows. Why? Because the goal is to acquire Bitcoin before they revalue it. Let's say they accumulate 1 million Bitcoin. When the time is right, they will make the announcement. The U.S. Strategic Bitcoin Reserve is operational. And for balance sheet purposes, Bitcoin will be valued at $1 million per coin. This is the exact same strategy as the 1934 gold revaluation. tenfold or more revaluation overnight. Their 1 million Bitcoin, acquired for maybe $100 billion, is suddenly worth $1 trillion on the government balance sheet. They have created nearly $1 trillion in balance sheet value just by changing the price tag. Combine the two, $5.2 trillion from gold plus $1 trillion from Bitcoin. That is a total of $6.2 trillion in new balance sheet value created out of thin air. The government can use this $6.2 trillion to technically offset the debt, making the debt-to-GDP ratio look much better and allowing them to claim solvency. But here is the catastrophic, fatal consequence for everyone holding dollars. The revaluation of gold and Bitcoin upward is the devaluation of the dollar downward. They are two sides of the same coin. If gold, which was $2,800, is suddenly valued at $20,000, the dollar has lost 85% of its value relative to gold. If Bitcoin, which was $100,000, is suddenly valued at $1 million, the dollar has lost 90% of its value relative to Bitcoin. The average person doesn't think about gold or Bitcoin. They think about groceries, rent, and gas. When the dollar loses 85% to 90% of its value relative to hard assets, it loses 50% to 70% of its value relative to everything else. This is where the silent confiscation happens. Imagine you have $100,000 saved in a bank account today. You think you are stable. The government executes the revaluation. Over the next 3 years, inflation is not 3% or 5%. It hits 20% to 30% annually. This is not the fake CPI number. This is the real inflation you feel. Food prices double. Gas prices triple. Rent increases 60%. Your $100,000 in savings now buys what $35,000 bought 3 years ago. You lost 65% of your purchasing power. The government, meanwhile, celebrates. Their debt is still $37 trillion nominally, but in real terms, adjusted for the inflation they caused, it is now worth $12 trillion. They erased $25 trillion of debt burden, not by paying it, but by destroying the currency it was denominated in. They stole $25 trillion from creditors, savers, and dollar holders, and gave it to themselves in the form of reduced debt. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the historical pattern. The historical evidence is overwhelming, and it's always the same story. Weimar Germany, 1920s. The government couldn't pay its war reparations. The mark collapsed. They printed money. Hyperinflation destroyed the German middle class. People needed wheelbarrows of cash to buy a loaf of bread. But the government's internal debt was erased. Zimbabwe, 2000s. The government printed money to cover deficits. The Zimbabwe dollar became worthless. The government debt disappeared, but the people's life savings were vaporized. Venezuela, 2010s. The government prints bolivars. Hyperinflation destroys the economy. The debt burden is eliminated. The pattern is universal. Government gets fatally over-indebted. Government devalues the currency. Savers and creditors lose everything. Government survives. The U.S. is following the exact same script, but with better branding. They are not calling it money printing. They are calling it strategic reserve revaluation. They are not calling it currency debasement. They are calling it a return to a gold-backed dollar. They are not calling it theft. They are calling it necessary policy to preserve American financial stability. But the outcome for your bank account is identical. You lose, and the government wins. And here is the final, undeniable proof that the reset is imminent. The world central banks are preparing. For the last 3 years, central banks around the world have been buying gold at record rates. In 2022 and 2023, they bought over 2,000 tons of gold. That is the most since 1950. Why? Because they are not blind. They have the economic advisors and the intelligence to see what is coming. They are diversifying out of the dollar and preparing for the monetary reset. China is stockpiling gold and accumulating Bitcoin through state-owned enterprises. Russia is reducing its dollar reserves. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa are actively developing alternative payment systems to bypass the dollar. They are building the infrastructure for a post-dollar world. If the governments with the most inside information are preparing for a dollar collapse, why are you still fully exposed? The time for waiting is over. The window to position yourself correctly is closing fast. You must stop thinking about wealth in terms of dollars. You must start thinking about wealth in terms of purchasing power. The dollar is the Titanic, and the iceberg is $37 trillion in debt. Here is the urgent action plan you need to follow right now to survive the silent confiscation. Action point 1. Get out of dollar-denominated paper bonds or death. Any long-term asset denominated in dollars, government bonds, corporate bonds will lose 70% of its value in real terms. Sell them now. Cash is death. Holding large amounts of dollars in savings accounts, checking accounts, or money markets means you are guaranteed to lose purchasing power. Minimize your cash holdings. Keep only what you need for a few months of expenses, no more. Your checking account is the exact opposite of a safe harbor. It is the confiscation zone. Action point 2. Get into hard assets. You need assets that cannot be printed by a central bank. Physical gold. This is the 5,000-year proven store of value. You need physical coins or bars that you hold securely, not a paper gold ETF that can still be subject to counterparty risk. Gold will preserve your purchasing power through the reset. This is your insurance policy. Bitcoin. If you understand the technology and can hold it securely in your own wallet, Bitcoin is digital gold. It is more volatile, but the government is about to revalue it to $1 million, effectively legitimizing it and giving it massive upside as the ultimate digital scarce asset. You need to get in before the government's own revaluation makes the price surge unavoidable. Real estate. Productive property is key. Rental properties in strong markets or land that can produce food will survive the inflationary collapse. These assets inflate in nominal terms, meaning your wealth is preserved through the transition. Action point 3. Get out of debt. While some people argue debt will inflate away, you cannot print your income. When the dollar collapses, your wages will not keep up with 30% or 50% annual inflation. You will be repaying cheap dollars with even cheaper, but fewer, real wages. For individuals, debt becomes a fatal trap. Pay off high-interest debt. Credit cards, personal loans, car loans, get rid of it. The only debt you can possibly keep is a low fixed-rate mortgage, 3% or 4%. That debt will be inflated away over time, but all other high-interest, variable debt must be eliminated. Action point 4. Diversify internationally. Do not keep 100% of your wealth in U.S. dollar assets. Open accounts in foreign banks and hold foreign currencies that have stronger fundamentals, Swiss francs, Singapore dollars, or the Norwegian krone. Look for currencies from countries with low debt and strong, non-debt-based economies. The goal is to have wealth in multiple jurisdictions, so when the dollar crisis hits, you are not 100% exposed to the fallout. This is not about being a pessimist. This is about being a realist. The numbers do not lie. The history books do not lie. The central banks do not lie with their gold buying. The U.S. government has only one move left, and they are setting up the pieces right now with the strategic Bitcoin reserve and the gold narrative. They have chosen devaluation over default because devaluation destroys the people's wealth but preserves the government's power. The choice is now simple: adapt or be destroyed. Position yourself in hard assets, preserve your purchasing power through the reset, and use that preserved wealth to rebuild your life on the other side. Do not hold dollars, believe the government's narrative, and watch your life savings evaporate. The only question left is which side of the great wealth transfer you are going to be on. Subscribe now to track the 2027 reset in real time.